Will you come and follow me if I but call your name? That's the first line from one of my favorite hymns. It's number 757 in our green hymnal, Wonder, Love, and Praise. Sometimes it's called the summons. And that question is the essential plot in today's gospel. Will you come and follow me if I but call your name? But we who know the story of Jesus' life and work recognize that there's a lot more going on in today's reading, and a lot more going on to walking the path with Jesus than just that, just saying yes. Here's the rest of that verse. Will you go where you don't know and never be the same? Will you let my love be shown? Will you let my name be known? Will you let my life be grown in you and you in me? I couldn't stop that hymn. It's one of my favorites from running through my mind as I read today's gospel. Today, the good news is all about the call, the summons, as that hymn calls it. God's call to Jesus and Jesus' call to every person to join him in a pilgrimage that at every turn opens to new vistas. Some of those turns are subtle, slow-paced. Some are as startling as a storm and the multiple rainbows that surprise us once the storm has passed. We've all had those shocking storms and maybe some surprising rainbows. So life often seems like a kaleidoscope to me. That make just one little turn and then everything seems to shift. It turns something that had seemed minor into something serious and really can rearrange how our life and how we look to ourselves. It's startling to me how radically small changes can shift all the pieces in who we are, triggering a long rearrangement, either snapping everything into place or creating a totally new puzzle. Just look at what happens in Jesus' life. Already, Joseph, head of the household into which Jesus is born, is wise enough and protective enough to have listened to that angel of the Lord who warned him in a dream about Herod, who was determined that no newborn king was going to spoil his reign. Herod planned to kill all the children in and around Bethlehem under 2 years of age. So Joseph had to abandon his hope of taking his family home in Bethlehem. Instead, he has to flee with the family to Egypt for safety and to stay there with him until Herod dies. When Herod dies, he moves them north into Galilee, to Nazareth. He wants to stay out of Jerusalem's political hotbed there in the south of the part of the country. The pieces of Joseph's life have turned like a kaleidoscope, and the whole family's life is rearranged. When Jesus becomes an adult, he is wise enough and perhaps curious enough to seek out that cousin of his, John the Baptist, who is preaching down along the Jordan River in Judea to the south of where Jesus has lived. John's message to the people of that Judean countryside is, "Repent, the King of Heaven has come near." Now an adult, Jesus decides to travel back southward from Nazareth and meet John in the wilderness of Judea at the Jordan River. And there Jesus asks him to baptize him, an act that manifests God's saving presence here among the human race. And then he's led by the Spirit into the temptations in the wilderness, and his faithfulness to God remains intact, and angels minister to him. And then it's not so long before Jesus hears that, John has been arrested. Danger, danger, once again. So Jesus heads north out of Judea into Galilee. And he goes on another 20 miles past his hometown, Nazareth, and takes up a home in Capernaum on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. This is the territory that was called Zebulun and Naphtali. Two of the original Israelite tribes were given that land when God allocated the promised land. And this is what Isaiah said about that area. He had called it a land of darkness because by the time he wrote, the Assyrians had taken it away from the Israelites. By Jesus' day, Rome has claimed it, and it's called Galilee now. The Jews who live in Galilee, that northern part of the country, are mostly farmers and sharecroppers and fishermen, but the Greeks are the ones who fill the towns. The pagans, in other words, are in control. It's a place that's under occupation by death and taxes, a place of darkness and hoping and wishing for light. The Judeans to the south think Jerusalem and around about there. Think the Galilean Jews, like Jesus, are poorly spoken, ignorant, maybe not worth worrying about, certainly not God's favorite children. But that's where Jesus starts his ministry. He calls out to some of those fishermen, Peter and Andrew, James and John, and invites them to be his first disciples. He's creating a new kind of household, in a sense, beginning a new kind of tribe, not one based on genes, but on doing God's will, being God's people. And these 4 men say, yes, we will. The invitation to live by God's reign, to live in God's rearranging presence and God's healing of their lives. These fishermen are going to be announcing God's kingdom wherever they go, and they will be hopefully embodying the ways in which God calls our true names. They will be displaying how things inside us can shift when God calls us and life doesn't look the same anymore. In fact, the vision with which these first disciples were raised has just begun to be rearranged by this call from Jesus. Will you leave yourself behind if I but call your name? Will you care for cruel and kind and never be the same? Will you risk the hostile stare should your life attract or scare? Would you let me answer prayer in you and you in me? This week, we got a letter from our diocesan office announcing that today, and from here on out, every third Sunday in Advent, when we read about the call of Jesus' first disciples, we will celebrate what General Convention has called Religious Life Sunday, meaning the monks and nuns and other communities of folks who are either vowed or dedicated to the Christian life. So we got a letter this week, all of us clergy at least, from Sister Hannah. She is prioress of the Sisters of St. Mary at Swanee. And she wrote us a letter to share the news. She reminds us in that letter that monastics have a long history of enriching the church through their call to a life of prayer and service in the world. They may risk a hostile stare every now and then because they're wearing these vestments and they are marked for everybody to see. And if you've been a person who's felt rejected by a Christian community or two, that doesn't make you want to cozy up to a monk or a nun. But they know that, and that's the cost of their discipleship. It's a little bit like the cost that sometimes wearing a black clergy shirt and a white collar costs you. And all of us are glad to pay it. In ancient times and now, spiritual seekers have often found a monk or nun to be a good spiritual director for them, and priests as well, to help them discern the call of God in their lives. And their religious houses, those who live together in their own space, have also been known as places of safe refuge and hospitality. And today they still invite all to come for hospitality, worship, retreat, and spiritual discernment. The convent I know best is St. Mary's on top of Swanee Mountain. And many times it has been a spiritual retreat, a place of refreshment for me, as well as a place where I could meet like-minded folks to share and learn and study, to be challenged or comforted. It has a great view off the bluff of Swanee Mountain into the valley below. And on Sunday mornings, after the early service, they have a biscuit and honey breakfast, to which everybody's invited. But there are also trails to hike, and you can worship in their small, beautiful chapel, or you can go down the road to the University Chapel if you like. Some vowed groups offer pilgrimages or trips to holy sites. We did that at St. Stephen's. I was not a monk or a nun, and neither was my husband or the parents of the teenagers we took out there. But we went to South Dakota to visit the Lakota Sioux families in the Episcopal Diocese. I know you have participated in, some of you, in pilgrimages. If you followed Cal, you probably went to another continent. But there are lots of other pilgrimages around that are a lot closer to home. There are also what we call intentional communities. They're not vowed religious. They don't wear different clothes, but they live in their own home and work in the world, and they are dedicated to God. Any of these people can help you find a holy place in your life, a place where God's longing for you and your longing for God become evident. There's a website listed in your bulletin where you can go and search for religious orders and Christian communities and find a bunch of Episcopal possibilities. Would you let the blinded see if I but call your name? Will you help set the prisoners free and never be the same? Will you kiss the leper clean and do such as this unseen and admit to what I mean in you and you in me? Sometimes trying to live the life of a Christian, I've looked around and at least recently have said that, sometimes we spend a lot of energy separating our kind from their kind. And I don't think that's quite what Jesus intended, rather than, because it's not that welcoming fold into which he invites the disciples. And we're not only his disciples, we are also his deputies, just as he will send them out later to do his work. You are his deputy today when you help an older friend move from their longtime home into adult living. Moves are hard. Sometimes you are a deputy for Christ when you are present as somebody recounts their treasured memories and looks through all the things they have kept through their lives, the photos of childhood, hand-sewn baby clothes, a baby mug, all those things that we can't remember without those little things to see. Or your moment might be babysitting for a family who've lost a grandparent. It might be healing the world with kindness exactly the way those people that Mr. Rogers called the helpers do, in unseen kaleidoscopic sequences of quietly tending to the world's crumbling edges. Will you love the you hide if I but call your name? Will you quell the fear inside and never be the same? Will you use the faith you found to reshape the world around through my sight and touch and sound in you and you in me? Which brings up for me the question, who knows your name, your true name, your spiritual name, if you will? Who really gets you? Who every so often calls you by that name so that you don't forget that it's good for you to live it? Who knows you deeply enough that their attention encourages you to offer yourself to the world without any pretense or shame or ego's desire? Whose presence is so aware of who you are and what you need that just being around them allows you to settle in and relax into your gifts and your purpose? Christ's sight and touch and sound are there in all those instances. Whom have you been that well loved by? Whether that person is a friend or a spouse or a parent or a sibling, who has read better sometimes than you can read yourself? Who's read by your actions and your demeanor and just knowing you, who you really are? Who recognizes when you're tired or restless? Recognizes your imagination when it's really excited, or noticed when your eyes go soft, filled with love light? who's alert to your sadness and your anxiety. You may not even be noticing what's going on in your soul because you're just too distracted by the calendar or your to-do list or your hunger for doing things perfectly and getting some recognition for it. But that person does, the one who loves you, because he or she sees you as Christ does. Blessed are those who so love us, for their open, generous attention helps us to notice the call of God that is already planted in our hearts and is wanting us to grow it. Those people help us to remember, to listen to our lives, to watch out for where the Spirit's energy is bubbling up. And when we're caught up in the rapids, tells us just to lean back against the Spirit and float it through, as if you were on one of those big inner tubes on a stream in the Smokies. That's the kind of attention Jesus seems to focus on the people around him as he begins to grow into God's call for his own life. Lord, your summons echoes true when you but call my name. Let me turn and follow you and never be the same. In your company, I'll go where your love and footsteps show. Thus I'll move and live and grow in you and you in me. It's the light inside us by which God calls others out of their darkness, out of their Zebulun and Naphtali, and into Christ's light. Only one in whom the love light shines can call forth our deepest, most shade-hidden hearts. Both those three magi and the first disciples are called out of their own territories of darkness and toward the light that Jesus is. And that's a call that can only be made by love, the love of God. So whom are you listening to for that call? Who is it that knows your name, who reads you, really gets you, who knows you deeply enough that their attention encourages you to offer to the world yourself, your whole self? Whose presence is so aware that you can settle into yourself? Whether that person is a relative, a priest, a monk, a nun, or a teacher, they cheer and challenge you. Listen to him or her with your deepest heart and believe it. Blessed are we who are so loved, because all of us need it. And you might be the attentive one for someone else. So maybe you too will shift from gathering in fish to fishing for people, lifting them up as in a net, every color, every size, every name, into the net of Christ's unearned love, the net that God has lowered to us in order to draw us in. That's what Jesus gave to those when he encountered as he began living his yes to God's call on his life. So pour out your bounty on the world. Don't be afraid to arise and shine, as Isaiah predicted long ago. For your light has come, does come, will come. It's the glory of the Lord shining through you.